Namaste, viewers. Greetings from New York on the 9th of May. It is Mother's Day, so wishing everybody a happy Mother's Day. Although in our Hindu way of life, parents are prayed every day. We pay respects to parents every day. But since in America it is designated as Mother's Day, let's talk about the Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day to all. I have called upon this program God, Godmen, and Godzilla. Now, why I did the titling of God, Godmen, and Godzilla is because, we all attribute everything to God. And then we know, since we have not known where God is, there are some people who assume the role of being visited by God, or they have the realization or revelation of being Godmen, become a Godman. They carry the message of God to everybody. In the process, we know many Godzillas are created. So it is a very serious matter, but also to be understood in a manner that everything in the life around us, many people are asking, in this era of pandemic, in this time of pandemic, where is God? Is it a law of karma applying? Are we those who are dying because their karma was to die because of this? So there are a lot of unanswered questions. Why people are blaming India for all the deaths that are happening in the second wave, but people are not blaming others who caused it. Nobody's trying to find out. It almost appears that the media doesn't want to talk about it. We'll talk about all of these issues, and I have great pleasure in welcoming two young men, one in the west coast of America, Vishal, Ganeshan, and the Ruchir Sharma, who is in Geneva. Both of them are very bright young men, and I really admire. I'm particularly happy to see Vishal for the first time, and his beard and his hair reminds my beard and my hair one time when it was very black and a lot of hair on top. So thank you very much, Vishal, and welcome Ruchir as well. So let's hit off with this issue. The print and the media is unaware of the message of God, if I may put it. People in various garbs of being advisors are spreading messages that are very, very remarkable. We live in a world where the cloud stores the data and heavens through AI sends the messages of even training people and doing varieties of things. So once upon a time when we said God is in the heavens or in the cloud, we know artificial intelligence lives in the cloud. So there are many issues that are intriguing to the people with the advent and growth of science and technology. And I wanted to have your thoughts on this matter, that we are living in a time where a former president has been barred from Facebook and Twitter in the name of freedom of speech, whereas many tyrants, dictators, and communists are all roaming around the Twitter and spreading their message. Where is God? We are not theologians. So we are not talking about the existence of God, but the narrative is important. The Hindu narrative, the Indian narrative, the Desi narrative. And we live in this piece. Our narrative is just not identical to the young people living in India. Their storyline is different. So speaking from the youth of America, youth of Europe, how do you start talking about the Hindu narrative? And you, Vishal, have spelled Hindu as Hindoo, which is very appropriate to say so, because BU used in BUT becomes but. So the point is, but in ROOM it means a room. So that's very interesting that you classified it. So Vishal, tell us about your thought about the entire medium of exchange through Godmen that is happening. Who are these modern Godmen that are creating the narrative for the rest of the world, who spread the message of God? God ordained leadership on kings and leaders. but the advisors were visited upon by the spiritual, by God Himself. So tell us your thought on that, Vishal.
Sure. So thank you for having me. Specifically with regards to the point about the Hindu with the two O's, the reason I spelt it that way, and this is still, to this day, for background, I curate this account called Hindu History, which is HINDOO history. It's on Twitter, Instagram, and Substack. And the reason I spell it with the two O's, and it's still the most common question I get, is to distinguish the Hindu with the two O's from, actual Hindus or, actual Indians. And the point is that, American readers were kind of reading representations of the Hindu, accounts of the Hindu from the early 19th century, and it wasn't just in newspapers, it was also in theater, in fiction writing, even traveling magicians going around America claiming to be Hindus, So there was a kind of a fleshed out representation in the average American imagination about what the Hindu was. And, there was, a bunch of different sources from which they were able to get this information, like part of it was, material culture. America had a trade relationship with India from the, 18th century. And so there was, this kind of steady flow of commercial goods coming into America from India. And, this kind of acted as a catalyst for people to start imagining, the Orient and what was going on in India. Then there was also kind of missionary journals, right? I mean, there were a lot of missionaries active in India at the time, and they would publish missionary journals, and then these accounts would subsequently get republished in American newspapers, specifically in New England. And so they would, take all this information that they were receiving, having never actually met a practicing Hindu or never been to India, and they kind of construct in their mind this conception of what the Hindu was and what the Hindu believed. And this is specifically what that Hindu HINDOO refers to. It's a construct, and it's not, one of the things I often say in my work is I'm not really concerned with the veracity of these claims. Like you see a lot of fantastical claims that these newspapers publish about India and about Hindus, but it's not really the goal of Hindu history to determine whether these are true or not, because I'm more interested in the narrative that formed in the American cultural and media imagination based on these representations. So I think that if you talk about media today, I mean, I think that you encounter a lot of the same issues, right? Like ultimately in America, I think what you see is a clash that's getting increasingly more acute between these representations, a lot of which are kind of historically inherited, but still are very influential in the kind of cultural imagination. And, they still kind of are I would say, a prevailing narrative in the mainstream media. But then you have, obviously the difference now is that you have a lot of Hindus and Indians in America who are closer to the tradition or in the community, who are starting to realize that these representations don't accurately reflect our experience. So, I think that's what's kind of accelerating this pessimism and this sort of skepticism towards the media and towards these representations is, understanding that they're not accurate. I think, one of the first steps to kind of take that forward is to understand the historical origins of these representations. So that's what I try to do with Hindu history.
That's brilliant. You mentioned about the narrative, the information flow, and how the world describes certain things in a certain way. And what gathers my attention today, and Ruchir, I'm coming to you with that narrative, is that today India is suffering heavily on account of the second wave of coronavirus. I still call it Wuhan virus because it emanated from Wuhan. So I have no hesitation in saying that. I'm not going to be politically correct about it. But I'm looking at the data. Today morning, somebody had said that there are data of India's deaths have been highly suppressed. And somebody talked about the fact that there are more than 1 million deaths. Now, today's world, it is very difficult to hide something. I remember that about 10 or 12 years ago, when I was in Middle East consulting with an investment banker, I wrote an article that technology will force transparency and honesty in people because you can't hide anymore. And once you are established as a liar, because your data can be visualized, can be seen, can be proven, then you are perpetually a liar. The tag of misrepresentation is something that nobody wants. But here is some data that I'm gathering from the global channel of Google. I mean, the modern guru, if you say so. So which every information is available. And I'm tracking the data from 5th of May, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th. So between 5th and 9th of May, I'll just so that time is short, US had data has gone up from 32.5 million cases to 32.7 million cases. India has gone up from 20.3 million cases to 22.3 million cases. Total number of deaths 222,000 in India to 242,000. But United States death was 577,000 to 581,000. Now, even a very reputed editor from India talked about that India, percentage-wise, is capturing a huge lot. But people forget that India is still, despite the tragic attack in the second wave, is 340,000 less deaths in India. Now, the narrative is as if Modi is to be blamed for everything, just as in this part of the world, Mr. Cuomo got the Emmy Award for his renditions of reporting to the press. But Arvind Kejriwal and Maharashtra Chief Minister Uddhav Thackeray of Mumbai and Delhi, they are getting a clean chit from the media. What's happening on that account? Which Godmen is creating that narrative that people need to worry and people need to take cognizance of? Ruchir.
So to build on Vishal's point and answer this question, you can draw a straight line from the depictions of India in the 1800s to what they are today. And what it basically is, it is that the West likes to treat countries like India, its former colonies, as a blank canvas on which to paint their own fears, their own aspirations. And in this case, because of the severity of the second wave, they can use it in order to uh, portray, a message of, oh, this is what would happen in our country if we don't take the right measures. That's maybe a good faith argument, but a bad faith argument is, look how bad these people are doing. We might have done badly, but it could be worse somewhere else. And this is something you especially see in sensationalized reporting, in voyeuristic depictions of funerals, of cremation grounds, that despite the death rate and the case rate being 1/10 of what they were in Italy, what they were in Germany, what they were in France, what they were in the US, by depicting it in this graphic way, you can create a narrative of, oh, look at these poor savages. We gave them independence, and this is what they do with it. They're not capable of managing themselves, and it helps feed into their sense of grandeur. It helps feed into their empire nostalgia in case of the British, or their empire power projection in case of the American media. And one has to remember that in the Western world, the free media, the so-called free media, are basically propaganda wings of the establishment. They don't go against what the government wants in terms of geopolitics, in terms of foreign policy, because there's complete consensus on it. It doesn't matter which party is in power. The security and intelligence agencies have a fixed agenda and have cultivated people in the media. And their interest is to show countries like India, or even South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, or Brazil in a constantly negative light, because it helps push a certain narrative. It justifies their interventions in these countries. It justifies their civilizing mission, the continued cultural colonization, political, economic neocolonialism in these countries. And it also applies a nice balm on the local populace in these countries, that yes, you might be suffering. Maybe you lost your job due to the coronavirus. Maybe the lockdown has affected people's mental health. Maybe you lost people during the first and second wave in the West. But hey, at least it's not as bad as in India. At least it's not as bad as in Brazil. And this is something that many people were calling out even before the second wave. Before the second wave hit, there were articles in the Washington Post or in Time or in the New York Times, basically asking, why aren't Africans and Asians dying like flies? We're dying in the West. We spend so much on healthcare. We have the best healthcare systems in the world. And, these people living in poverty, they've got out without any casualties, virtually any casualties. And this is something that many African commentators and activists called out. They said, "Oh, we're sorry that we're not dying like flies to make you feel better about your failings." And that's basically what it is. The depictions of Latin America, Asia, Africa are designed for an audience at home to help justify continued colonial practices, as well as to help them feel better about the failings or what they can't change about their own societies, which they feel powerless about. And secondly, to manufacture consent for a more interventionist foreign policy, that this can be used as an excuse for regime change.
It brings me back to my favorite thought process, is that Europe's contribution to world peace is giving the world 2 world wars. And they were not actually world wars. They were local conflicts of Europe that became a world war because the colonial powers used their imperial holdouts to fight for them and die. That's why it became a world war, apart from the Japanese thing coming in the Second World War. But it was all European theater. It became a global play in a different way. Having said that, obviously, God created the universe and he did not create the function of control. It is a man-made thing. So Vishal, I wanted to ask you about this narrative part of it. It's very important because you have done some historical research on how the narrative was talked about Indians, and Ruchir has mentioned about how the Western people have controlled the media. Why is it that people like us, what bothers me, and I will preface it by saying that Sanatan Dharma ought to be the practice of the world. That's the scientific, rational basis of the nature that exists within us. But it's the halal certification that's more important. Why haven't we made the forays and headways that we ought to have made? And that is because why? Why haven't we progressed in the same manner that Europeans are trying to control the world?
I mean, I can just speak from the perspective of Hindu history, and I think it's a difficult issue because I think that on the one hand, you're against a kind of narrative that has been shaped against your interests, right? It's been shaped. One of the things that I learned from Hindu history, and it's kind of what the project, now that I've kind of advanced in the chronology and I'm in the 20th century, one of the interesting things about the project now has been tracing how different narrative threads intertwine and how they interact. And I think one of the things I've learned is that, there's a lot of different representations of the Hindu that emerged in American history. And they all kind of emerge from, like the narratives themselves are downstream from certain, I would say, cultural groups, right? Or interest groups, whatever you want to call them. So for example, like the 3 main threads that I kind of discuss are, first is this sort of commercial or mercantile thread. This was India, America's relationship with India before, you had the kind of missionary involvement, before you had, elite reception of Hindu spirituality. It was really dominated by the mercantile relationship because you had a lot of New England merchants who were, going to Calcutta to engage in commerce. And this relationship was actually quite respectful. And, this was also consistent with the early East India Company. They weren't really interested in proselytization or evangelization. They really were just trying to maintain some sort of semblance of peace so they could continue to extract resources and, keep their commercial trade alive. And, the same was true of American traders. Like they weren't really interested in any sort of religious battle, or, they weren't really interested in converting the pagans to Christianity. They just wanted to trade. And, they had these good relationships with intermediaries in Calcutta. And so, you see that emerge in a lot of the correspondence you see from these New England merchants. Also, you kind of can trace this throughout, American history, kind of culminating with, what we're seeing with yoga now. Although that's a little bit more complicated. But the second narrative, you had this mercantile relationship, and then you kind of had the emergence of missionary boards, right, which were these sort of local organizing bodies that helped churches in America coordinate missionary trips to India. And I think this is really where the narrative switches, because you start getting a lot more of this literature, talking about, the iconic example here is Claudius Buchanan. He was an Anglican missionary who was active in India, and he was famous for writing the account of the Juggernaut, which was an anglicized rendition of Jagannath Yatra, right? and his account was very vivid, and it was very bloody. He talked about how people were throwing themselves under the wheels of the truck. They were sacrificing themselves. They were, the temples were made of human bones. It was very, like, the imagery was very violent and bloody, because the purpose was to get American churchgoers and readers of this literature, to give them a sufficient level of fear, that they were like, oh, we have to save these people from these sort of like demonic rituals and all this.
Which is funny, by the way, because today you have people like Shashi Tharoor who still use juggernaut in that sense, that they say, so Shashi Tharoor or Moitra, they like to say that, in West Bengal the Trinamool Congress has stopped the juggernaut of the BJP winning elections. Now that's not in the positive sense of Jagannath Yatra. Right. That's in this colonized depiction written by missionaries to manufacture consent for the dehumanization of native Indian populations, traditions. And unquestioningly, they still use it. They adopted it. They use it with pride. And like, oh, look at all the big words I know. I can use juggernaut.
Yeah, it's a lot of historical ignorance, I think, around that term now. And but the interesting thing about it too is, like, so Buchanan, he wrote this account, and it led to a lot of, whenever there's fear, there's also fascination, right? So a lot of other people went to go travel there to go see it for themselves, and what they found out is that he was basically fabricating all of this, right? Like, there was no human sacrifice, like none of this was true, And but what happens is that you get these people who go there and they start understanding, like, okay, well, what Buchanan actually wrote isn't an accurate depiction of what's going on. But the narrative switches, right? So instead of saying, like, look at this demonic, very violent ritual, they say the Jagannath Yatra is very peaceful, and that's because the British made it peaceful, right? Like, it used to be really bad, and then the British came in and they basically regulated it, and they passed laws banning all the really bad stuff, and now it's this wonderful, festive, peaceful, religious festival, which it always was. But you can see how these narratives are downstream from, like, particular political and sociological, theological disputes, and I think that's kind of the understanding we need to have is, like, okay, like, I think we forget, like, we focus too much. It's important, I think, to counter the narrative itself on a factual basis. Obviously, you have to do that, but you also have to kind of establish, the institutional and cultural presence in order to kind of propagate a counter narrative or interests in a concerted way. And I think that's where we have so far failed. I mean, it's one thing you can call out all the distortions you want, but until you kind of fix the underlying lack of institutional heft, I think it's difficult to kind of propagate a counter narrative in a concerted way.
You use the word the way we have failed, and Ruchir, I'm coming to you with this thought of mine, is that there is nothing wrong in failing. Nothing wrong. We can't always win. We can't always be right. There are wrong. The important part is, what lessons did we learn? Are we in the 21st century knowing what we do now? No. Are we on the path of corrective things, or we are not yet? What must happen for us to be able to be motivated and charged up, just as it happened in the US when you witnessed how the cry against the manipulation of the swastik as a hate symbol gathered momentum, and it brought about the unity amongst all segments of Hindus. That was another issue that came to my mind. So pardon me if you seem to be harassed or barraged with a lot of thoughts, but that's the nature of the beast that I am, in the sense that we have limited time, we have a lot to cover. And I said to you earlier on that this is just the beginning, because narrative building doesn't happen in 45 minutes or 1 hour of conversation. Share your thoughts on that. that unity happens when you have a purpose. That's my thought process. We united behind the attack on swastik. We united behind the attack on the caste thing that happened. And Vishal, you were participant in the event at New Jersey in Rutgers. So, Ruchir, you tell us about what must happen for us to be responsive and correcting the history.
You've raised some excellent points there, and I think both of you identified that one of the failings that we as a community have experienced is the lack of building institutions. That after we received our independence, we were granted our independence. We didn't win it. We didn't acquire it. It was bestowed upon us out of a sense of gratitude by a certain post-colonial elite and a lack of ambition to change the status quo. There was no concerted effort to build a new or revive the old national identity or vision for independent India. If I were to ask you, what does the Republic of India stand for, in terms of civilizational values, in terms of national interest, in terms of social contract, none of these three things have been defined. And in the absence of a vision, in the absence of an identity, in the absence of institutions that can be channeled towards certain goals, we just exist as a semi-sovereign country. At best, if you really push someone within the establishment, within the bureaucracy, within the judiciary, what does India stand for? They'll say it's not Pakistan. It's a negationary identity that, there's Pakistan, which is a Islamist theocracy garrison state, and we're not that. That's not even a positive definition. It's just that, we're not Pakistan. And then they'll say, we can't become a Hindu Pakistan. But that was what happened at partition. That it was not that Pakistan was carved out of India as a punishment because we were not secular enough. The British Raj was divided into a Muslim homeland and a Hindu, Sikh, Jain homeland with significant minorities. Now, within that window, post-independence, there should have been some definition of what India stood for as this revived civilizational identity, because otherwise the partition was meaningless. The suffering was meaningless. The refugees who were exchanged at the borders, who were stripped of their homes, stripped of their ancestry, out of their history, and left with nothing. All of that suffering was meaningless. Now, other countries which have self-respecting state institutions have used this past failing, this suffering, this trauma as the foundation for what the country stands for and what should never be allowed to happen again, and what positive values the country seeks to project and goals that it sets. This can take the form of even small countries like Armenia. Armenia never forgets what the Turks did to them, never forgives what the Turks did to them, and rallies institutions, whether it's directed by the state or directed by the diaspora, to enforce this point wherever the community is. Similarly, you see the Jewish community around the state of Israel, as well as Jewish American advocacy groups, or within Europe. They say never again, that you should never allow the circumstances that led to that tragedy of the Holocaust to happen again. And they proactively work to prevent that. You have similar identification within a country like Greece. Greece had a similar experience to us, that it was partitioned. There was a population exchange between Greece and Turkey. And both Greece and Turkey understand very well what their civilizational heritage and identity is. So, and the diaspora reflects this as well. That if you look at Armenian Americans, if you look at Jewish Americans, if you look at Greek Americans and their advocacy groups, they're very effective in demanding policy changes, in defining their own community and their own values for themselves. They say that, it's not for anyone else to say what Judaism is or say what Greek history is. It's those who practice it, to whom it belongs. And anything else is a form of colonialism. That is the kind of self-respect and confidence that was never built up or rebuilt after independence. Instead, we have institutions without an identity, a state without an identity, and without those institutions to foster this, it's very difficult for people to do it themselves, because the state actually actively discourages you from doing that. They'll say, no, 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 that's beyond what's considered acceptable opinion within the republic. So that is one of the failings. That's something that needs to be addressed, because you can't have a modern state, governing or presiding over 1.3 billion people without some sort of vision for it, some sort of common plan. China is a country that has, a similar situation. It was also semi-colonized, and it faced civil war. It faced a warlord period. It faced humiliation at the hands of the Japanese, as well as the British, Germans, Austro-Hungarians, Americans, everyone. And what did they call it? They call it the century of humiliation. Their entire national identity now is based on, we will redeem ourselves after the century of humiliation. We will never let that happen again, and we will restore China to its proper place as the Middle Kingdom, as the center of civilization, like it was in ancient and medieval times. That's something that even communists in China do, but we can't do in India.
What is it? What is it? I'm Vishal, you are free to come in anytime. Just wanted to also mention here that you referred to, Ruchir, about institution building. In my struggle in establishing the Indian narrative was that I found totally the institutional element of our heritage and civilization totally missing. Although we may be a 70-year-old democracy, 70-year young democracy, but our historical roots go back even before any religion was formed. So think about it from this perspective. How did we lose that entire narrative, the way it is being talked about? And that brings me to a very interesting subject matter, which I noticed on the media, that how some very profound words like Guru, Pandit, mantra, these three profound words, which have deep meaning for us in India, are so cavalierly used in the Western media. It is always has a very interesting slant of negativity. The gurus of this or pandits of this or the mantra of that. I'm happy they adopted these words, but their usage is slightly negatively intoned, so that when you utter the word guru, you look at them as in a pejorative manner. You don't look at them as in an elevated sense. So, Vishal, you were going to say something. I wanted to also say that retaining the pride that we have. I tell you one thing, that Wuhan virus has been a gift to us Sanatanis. The universe has known now today that the various godmen, the magicians, have retreated perhaps to Hogwarts, the school of magic, to learn some new tricks when they come back out from there. But no magician is available. God is not helping. Karma is doing what it is doing. So there are a whole lot of storyline and build up on this. But India is being attacked incessantly, as if this is the only plot where all the evil lives. Vishal, you go ahead.
I just wanted to, I thought what Ruchir said was really insightful. And I think one of the interesting things I've kind of noticed, especially hearing him talk about Indian context, is I see how many parallels exist, in the diaspora. This idea of like India existing in a sort of limbo state where, it's has the kind of form and structure of a nation state, but it lacks the sort of identity and the sort of historical narrative that you usually find in nation states. And I think that there's an interesting parallel here, because I think, when you talk about, the failures of the Hindu American diaspora, in particular, which is kind of what I'm more concerned with for obvious reasons. I think one of the problems in our approach is that we often take it for granted that that community exists in the way that we think, like, the Muslim America diaspora exists, or like the, like what Ruchir said, the Greek American or Armenian American. And I think that sometimes when we use that language, we put the cart before the horse. And what I mean is that when you talk about, like, the existence of a given community in a political culture like America, I mean, what are the actual assumptions behind that, right? You're saying, like, okay, there's a distinct group of people who have a particular worldview, right? They're joined by certain principles, certain morals, certain fundamental assumptions that then produce, like, a distinct set of political and social and cultural goals that they can try to pursue in a concerted manner. This is what you're assuming when you refer to the Hindu American community. And in my view, like, those assumptions are kind of misguided. I mean, they're not an accurate representation of what the actual reality is. And I think until you kind of address that underlying issue, we can't expect we can't expect the Hindu American community to be more influential unless we actually build the foundation blocks of what that community is. So I think that you have to start with at the grassroots, right? And this is the institution building. And one of the points I think is I've been making recently, and I think it's something we lose sight of in a lot of ways. If you think about how the Indians came to America, like, a lot of the institutions that early immigrant groups built, especially temples, they kind of inherited the same model that there was in India, right? But we have to understand that the temple that people brought from India to America was already in a kind of debased form, right? I mean, this is an institution that was once the center of Indian society. It was not just a cultural and educational center, but it was also a financial center, right? I mean, we have the Chola period. You have temples basically acting as like venture capital firms, funding expeditions to Southeast Asia. And so, I think that one thing that the Hindu American community should think about, especially given the fact that, frankly speaking, I mean, living in America, you have more religious freedom than Hindus in India do, like, in terms of control over religious institutions, ability to kind of, use your resources to, whether it's for educational initiatives or cultural initiatives. So I think, rather than focus so much on, counter narrative, I think the real goal should be to focus on institution building at the grassroots, and wondering how, you have these temples. They're hubs for not just the community, but also hubs for organization and resource collection. How can you make these community hubs and really integrate them into the daily life of the community? How can you take them and use them as centers for education, centers for, whether just providing services to the community, maybe even setting up like parochial education. This is something that every community does in America, right? You have Jewish schools, you have Islamic schools. The Sikh community also has schools now, but this is something that we've never done. So, I think that we're really, it's a kind of a journey that maybe we're just kind of waking up to now, but there's a lot of work to be done, I think, on the grassroots. And then I think as you do that grassroots work, I think the rest of these issues start to kind of resolve themselves, because you start kind of developing the sense of like, oh, this is what we stand for. These are our values. This is what we actually, as Hindu Americans, like what we want, what we think is worth fighting for. And, so I think that should really be the focus for the diaspora community, at least.
Thank you. And welcoming, yes, you wanted to say something, Ruchir? Go ahead.
Yeah, just to add something quickly to it, that if you look at various religious communities around the world, most of them have some sort of base which is related and protected by a state. The Anglican Church has a defender of the faith, and that is the Queen of the United Kingdom. The Roman Catholic Church has the Vatican City, with all of the trappings of a state, its institutions, its financial mechanisms, with which it supports the community no matter where it is. Buddhists have their Sangha, which, there's various branches of it, but, they have states. So, for example, Thailand is a Buddhist state, and unapologetically so. Now, this is, and then, of course, you have the Jewish state in Israel. So this is something that's normalized. It's very normal to have an intersection between state institutions and religious institutions when looking at a globally dispersed community.
Thank you. Sanjay ji, welcome that you are part of the show now. I deliberately chose not to announce it so that people must not feel that I was trying to entrap them. But I want to, I want to
What
congratulate
do you
you.
think? Why do you think I'm a bait or something?
No, 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 I wanted to congratulate you for an awesome show that you did on Arvind Kejriwal with his muffler and everything else. That was really, really awesome. And I want to congratulate you because I didn't watch it
Thank
live,
you,
but I
thank you.
watched it later. And that was hilarious. We need humor in India. You know, like this, somebody, my boss in America, American Express, had told me, you Indians don't have a sense of humor. I said, no, we have it. We are not so public with it, our sense of humor. We also know how to laugh and smile at things. Having said that, you have been hearing about the conversation about
I came in
the
late, so I didn't catch.
no, the
I
basic
didn't,
the basic thing is that you can jump in any time with your thought. But important part is Ruchir and Vishal that today 30 countries, including in Times Square at 9 o'clock in the morning here, an hour ago, 2 hours ago, there was a demonstration for supporting the anti-killings in, sorry, let me rephrase it, for killings of Hindus and BJP workers in West Bengal. That was remarkably well done. What is important is that people are getting organized. Hindus are recognizing that if we don't do now, nobody is coming to our rescue. And that's where the activities overseas amongst Hindus is very, very potent now. Hindu temples are conducting classes. Yoga, meditation, breathing exercises have become part of mainstream. The problem is that we cede ground as if it is not ours. Even people who launch yoga meditation programs, they will specify and clarify, oh, it has no Hindu origin. That's where,
I think I had a program
yeah,
specifically on this about Satguru, if you
yeah,
remember. I think that Satguru website says something like this,
yeah,
and we actually had a program and actually repudiated it very strongly. Anyway, yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, talking about the trade part of it, Vishal, you mentioned that, in Wall Street, we have a building, which is heritage building now. It's called 1 Hanover Street. It's called India House. It's a beautiful club. It's a red brick building. I was a member of that club. But you know what was the only thing Indian about it? I was the member. Rest of it was not at all.
Yeah,
It was formed as a spice trade organization. It was a club
yeah.
and a center for the spice traders of as many centuries ago to do that. So the word India has been known around. But my thought process runs around on building what is it about Hindu mindset? Are we in denial? Although I'm seeing that Hindus are rising, like we get very impatient very quickly. Uh, your thoughts, Vishal. Based on your research and what is happening? I don't know.
I mean, I don't. I think it's I think it's a unique challenge. I think that Hinduism is kind of fundamentally different as a religious tradition. Compared to whether it's Islam or Christianity, in the sense that we don't make any exclusive claims to the truth, right? Like it's pretty easy to build a community if you're saying like, look, this is the answer, right? This is the one true answer, and this is the kind of the test of whether you're in or out, right? Is you accept that this is the one true answer, and that's not something that that's not something we have, right? So I think there's a much harder, it's a much more difficult task when you think about like consensus building and community building, when your fundamental premise is that there are many paths to the same truth, right? Because it's very hard to extricate that kind of respect for pluralism and diversity from the spiritual tradition itself. So I think that you have to try and find a way to balance, you have to try and balance that kind of spiritual inheritance with also the pragmatic side of it, which is that, look, we have to try and maintain the respect for the pluralism, the respect for the diversity, while also trying to create a community-driven consensus about sort of principles and goals that you can actually act upon. I think this is, I think this is the challenge. I think that it's I don't think I think you can learn a lot from other kind of religious communities, but I think that those comparisons only go so far, because I don't think Hinduism is the same. I think I've made this point before too. I think it's a mistake that people often make where, when, especially in the diaspora, I mean, in India, I think it's probably different, but in the diaspora, like when we think about religion, there's like we have a certain mental model in our heads, and that the mental model is kind of constructed based on our background knowledge about Christianity and Islam. Like this is, when you think about religion in the abstract, that's really what you're thinking about, right? Is one of these kind of Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic religions. And as a result, when you start asking questions about Hinduism, when you start talking about Hinduism, you kind of unconsciously apply that same mental model to Hinduism. And I think that's a kind of a problematic approach. I think whenever you do that, you end up applying constraints and strictures to your understanding of what this spiritual tradition, what this religion is, that impedes your ability to actually truly understand the nature of the challenges we face. So I think, as a first step, we have to start thinking about Hinduism as kind of a sui generis system of thought and system of belief. And you have to work within those unique constraints and not try to apply a mental model that is kind of foreign, to this thought system, So I think that's, acknowledging that is the first step. And then you have to kind of, try to focus on the pragmatic elements of community building and consensus building. I mean, there's no getting away from that, like you ultimately are not going to be able to lobby successfully for your political interests or your cultural interests unless you're able to build a consensus based on values, right? That's the only way you can persuade people to support any sort of initiative. It's not enough just to say, believe whatever you want, do whatever you want, because if you do that, then anyone can claim to speak on your behalf, right? And say, like, as a Hindu, I think X is true, even if X is, perceived to be against the interests of the community. So I think there has to be a kind of grassroots, community-driven process where you get together with a broad swath of the community and try to kind of start from the beginning and say, like, what are our principles? Like, what are the actionable principles that we can actually work towards in an American political and social context, instead of just being reactive? Like right now, I would say, like, a lot of the work we do, and it's good to see people organizing, but like, you can't just be reactive constantly, right? Like, it's just you'll never actually make any forward progress if you're just trying to put out fires constantly. And I think that's kind of the transition we have to make.
Absolutely correct, which is my favorite thing. You guys have used words that are very dear to my heart, and I have used that. I've dealt with it all my life here. Pragmatism. We have to be practical. We can't always be sentimotional. I combined the two words, sentimental and emotional, into one word called sentimotional. So we can't afford to be sentimotional about everything. So that's what
you have to. This is I credit Ruchir with the cynical realism. This is I'm fully on board.
Right. So today, we have to find instruments where we have enough stories to unite behind. Today is the birth celebration, birth anniversary of Maharana Pratap Singh, a great warrior. I'm a great fan of his. I'm a great fan.
Also Rabindranath Tagore.
Yes, Rabindranath Tagore, who became Tagore. I don't know why, but be that as it may. Sanjay ji, your thoughts on this entire thing of narrative building, of institutional building, on a pragmatic way, what Vishal was talking about, what Ruchir is talking about, what I'm talking about. We are leading the same band. How do we play this?
I'll just take off from something that Vishal said, and that just struck me, that say that we are always being reactive. Yes. And in fact, we're not just being reactive, often we are being very apologetic. And why we are being apologetic is because I think we ourselves have an insufficient grasp of our own, quote unquote, religion. And we use religion, our Dharma, we call it religion, in the West, because it is easier for the West to grasp. Otherwise, there's a lot of confusion. And it is, you are familiar with this book, this booklet, actually, this small booklet. And this is kind of, especially when circulated among the youth, it does give them a very clear picture of what we are talking. Why? Because unless you have a very clear grasp in a very presented in a very simple manner of the comparative religions, and you always tend to kind of get confused, and they say that we have one God and you don't have, and without realizing that the frameworks are different. Number one, first of all, the frameworks are different. Their God resides in an intellectual framework, and actually, when you take it to the experiential or the consciousness framework of the dharmic system, then that intellectual framework is actually one step below. And that one step below that intellectual framework, it doesn't understand, or even if it does, because I know I've seen these Jesuits and their work and their research on the Hindu Dharma, Sanatan Dharma, or Buddhism, and they very clearly understand that these are, okay, we are a 4-plane geometry and they are a 3-plane geometry. And they don't want us to actually recognize that, and they don't tell that to their own people. So that our own people actually, because they're educated in the West, have lost that sense of framework. They don't understand that we have, when we say that there is that one consciousness that pervades everything and everything else is a manifestation, as the Vedas say. They say that, okay, rupam rupam pratirupam babhuv, rupam rupam pratirupo babhuv. That one form, it transcends and it multiplies into many. Or I think it is in Kathopanishads that it says, everybody they said ekam satvipra bodha vadanti. But that's a very, very elementary kind of thing, and that's kind of used for, I should say, people who are at a very basic level. And the thing that we should be able to tell everybody, that the nonsense that you talk about monotheism, that you have to clearly differentiate between monotheism and monism, because monotheism is at an intellectual level, monism at a superior level, at a higher level, at level of consciousness, at a level of experience, where you can become one with the divine. And then Kathopanishad says, ekam rupo bahudha yah karoti. Ekam rupam bahudha yah karoti. That he is one form and he multiplies into many, or he multiplies himself into many. So, starting from that framework, then you come to the different aspects which are common to all, I should say, all sects. Historically, we have 6 sects in Sanatan Dharma. We have this Shaiv, and we have Vaishnav, and we have Shakt, and we have this Kaumarik. That is, then we have this what is called Ganapatya, people who worship Ganesh. And there's a 6th, which one? I'll just remember it. So whether these are these sects, or you have Dvait or Advait or Vishishtadvait, or you have, even for that matter, Arya Samaj, which is a very, very Abrahamized form of Sanatan Dharma. All of them have a few things in common. And we should know that these are the things that we possess that the others do not possess. And what are these things in common? Number one, that we say that, okay, Dharma, and Dharma includes all the dharmic traditions, not just Sanatan. That is the Sanatan, Buddhism, Jainism, your Sikhism, even the Far Eastern religions like Shinto, or the Chinese religion, Tao, and that other one, what was called
Confucianism.
Yao Che or something. All of them, there are, number one, they are science. Why they are science? You do not agree by science, you can always say it is quasi-science. Because science has certain attributes. What are the attributes of science? The attributes of science are basically considered, I'll go by Karl Popper's definition. They are what? Let's say verifiability, universality, repeatability, and falsifiability. Are all these present in Dharma or not? You are encouraged to verify the existence of the divine by yourself. That is one. Is it universal or not? Dharma is always universal. It is not exclusive. It is for everyone. Repeatable? Yes. Guru can guide his disciple to repeat the experience that he has. It may not be, you have to differentiate between the what is called the pratyaksha praman, as we call it. The pratyaksha praman can both be empirical as well as experiential. And for that experiential truth, you need a guru. So that is the science part of it. And falsifiability, why? Because it is the only religion that encourages you to ask questions. That actually tells you that you can refute it. How did Buddhism arise? Buddhism arose by refuting certain principles of Sanatana Dharma. And on that, they had debates for almost a millennium. So we must remember this. Number one, the frameworks, and within the frameworks, number one, science. Number two, the time concept. Our time concept is cyclical. The Abrahamic time concept is linear, oblique, superlinear. Number two, the logic concept. Our logic concept is multi-valued. Their logic concept is binary. That should be very clearly understood by both of you. You know that. This is actually, I and Vibhuti have already had this discussion. So I'm basically addressing this to both of you. Then the third one is the epistemology. In our epistemology, in the dharmic epistemology, especially the Sanatana Dharma, where it has remained absolutely intact, and that also is actually encourages a lot of depredations on it, is that pratyaksha pramana is the highest pramana. And I often quote that Gita shlok on this, that says, what is this called? Sarvata, it is 2.46. Let me just check. Gita 2.46. So, Gita 2.46. Yeah. Well, showing a virus. Yeah. Yava anartha udpane sarvatah samplutodake tavan sarveshu vedeshu brahmanasya vijanatah. What it essentially says that if you're sitting next to a collection of a huge reservoir of fresh water, then the kind of requirement that you have for a small pond is similar to the requirement that you have for Vedas if you have actually experienced him yourself. So this is one of the best examples of support that supports what is called pratyaksha praman. And of course, I can recount so many, and it is something that is taken as an axiom, that pratyaksha praman is the highest praman. And what do you get in the Western religions? Word of God. Word of God. It's
And infallibility.
infallibility of the word of God. And if you say anything against the word of God, then you're likely to be either beheaded or likely to be cursed, as in Christianity. Otherwise,
Excommunicated.
burn you on stakes, all those kind of things that used to happen, Inquisition and all that. So So we got 4. And then coming out of that, our cosmology. Our cosmology recognized multiverses when? At least tens of thousands of years ago, we knew multiverses. We look at Surya Siddhant and all those books. And of course, the eschatology. The eschatology, that is this, the death theory. We look for liberation. And all the Abrahamic religions look for eternal bondage of either hell or heaven. They're actually seeking eternal bondage of heaven. It's other thing that, okay, some of them land up in hell. Of course, in Christianity, only 12 tribes are supposed to go to heaven. I don't know why there is so much of brouhaha about converting. And why don't these very converts, they understand this? That only 12 tribes are going to go to heaven. The number is also fixed, 144,000. So the 144,000 over millions of years, how many are going to get their place? And still they convert. So I think these basics, Vibhuti, you are muted. These basics, if we drill among all our people, I think these are things that are common to everyone. And we should actually propagate this as science, and science is the latest dogma these days. You know? I mean, if you tell somebody that, okay, this is science, they don't ask you questions. They don't ask you, okay, are you going to do an experiment and prove it for us? No, they still think, they say that, okay, that Newton's time, and they still go by Newton's time, little realizing that Newton's time has been repudiated long time back. They still talk about Newton. The Newtonian model has changed completely. That what is called the mechanistic universe model. That got changed first by the relativity of Einstein, and then was completely demolished by the quantum mechanics, because quantum mechanics actually brought this very much Vedantic concept, what it calls the superimposition of probability waves. I think that is the classic definition of quantum mechanics. So I think in these very simple terms, if you explain, and if you care to distribute this booklet around, I think we can get somewhere. That's what I think.
No, that is very essential, that understanding the whole concept that not all religions are not the same, just as all 4 of us are not the same. We are humans, we are men, we have same body parts performing identical function, but we are different. And that's the important part to remember, that in this God's created universe, he also introduced the concept of individual differences. So when we talk about equality can happen only with respect to individual differences, that we are all different. Unless and until that happens, we are not equal. We are not respecting anybody. That's why in Champions League soccer and everywhere else, you are talking about respect on the bands of captains and all the players. Respect. And that's what I tell my American friends and everybody else, that all you need to do is to import and practice only 2 words, one tenet of Hinduism, and that is respect and acceptance. That's it. Change the word tolerance, intolerant, to acceptance, tolerance to acceptance, and respect. That's all that matters in the life of all humanity. But what is important here is that, Sanjayji, we have been talking about, you use the word Brahman in the 2.46, and that is a thought that has been in the back of my mind. I always think about it, that originally the Brahmins were supposed to be the protectors, the minds, the best of minds, to protect and defend the concept of Sanatan and whatever our Dharma was. Where did the Brahman fail? Where did the Brahman fail in terms of protecting and defending the concept and not having the divide? So much so that right now, whenever it is an attack, it is always about the Brahman. And that's the thought process that I wanted to understand from all 3 of you, is that what's your thought on it? Where did the Brahman go wrong? The caste part of it. Some people say the caste was the British imposition. Somebody say it was Manu Smriti. Somebody says it was Varna system. Where do we actually stand on that? I have my answer, but I want to hear from all 3 of you, given the time that we have available right now. All 3 of you.
If I might begin?
Yes.
It also feeds into the previous question, which Vishal and Sanjay ji answered. And that is, unfortunately, over the past 70 to 100 years, we have internalized, at the academic and state institutional level, colonial interpretations of what our traditions are. This is an aberration. Very few other faith traditions are treated this way. The others are, Slavic paganism or African religions, which are, being slowly wiped out by Abrahamism over the past 70 years as well. And it's a very unfortunate affair that we have trapped ourselves in this box where it's, our faiths have been defined by the colonizer with their own agenda to demoralize, degrade our society, and it's worked quite well. So this is something that has to be addressed. So for example, we have a huge corpus of literature, of archives, chronicles, lying around in government offices, which have been untouched for decades. I believe 90% of the manuscripts on hand, and that is about 35 million manuscripts and chronicles and archives from ancient times, have not even been translated into modern languages or into a publicly accessible form. That is something that we should be taking seriously. And unfortunately, our state institutions consider that, and academia considers that, Hindu revivalism. Now, it's not Hindu revivalism, it is reclaiming our right to define our religious practices, our traditions for ourselves. Every other religion has this right, every other religion claims this right, and it's not for non-believers and non-practicing faiths to define it on our behalf. That is a violation of that respect for another individual's choice and right to believe what he or she wants to believe. So this is something that has to be addressed at a fundamental level, that we are not taking this seriously. So there are some people who think we should abolish humanities in India because it's not generating anything. No, humanities needs to be reformed. We have a huge corpus of knowledge, to the extent that we don't even know what we don't know. The Arth Shastra was only discovered in the 1920s. It was discovered in someone's house. That's how little we know about our own traditions. And in the absence of any effort to define this, be it by the state, be it by academia, be it by even NGOs, as a result, we are still dependent on what missionaries wrote 200 years ago in order to justify colonialism, in order to degrade and demoralize Indian society so that we would become more receptive and accepting of cultural, economic, religious colonization. Without that, how are we supposed to rebuild a narrative when we don't even have the right to define it for ourselves?
Vishal, you are part of the Hindu history narrative that you're building here. And what Ruchir is talking about, if we don't do that, how do we claim it all? What must happen that we claim it all?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting topic. I think a couple of, so specifically on this academic point, I think especially now here in America, the big controversy recently with Trishki, right? I think she attracts a lot of ire, obviously, because she's a particularly egregious example, but she's ultimately a symptom of a system, right? She's the kind of academic the system incentivizes and produces. And I think this is one thing we need to also grasp, is that academics are also incentive-driven people like anyone else, right? And like they're dedicating 10 years of their life to study Sanskrit, to study this history, study this tradition, and it's not a very favorable job market. So they're going to go where the resources are. They're going to cite the scholars who are influential in the field. They're going to cite the work that is considered influential. And I think one thing we need to really grasp and start to work on is understanding that until we take ownership of this cultural and intellectual tradition and start trying to put resources towards supporting scholars and supporting academics who are interested in these topics, like, this academic narrative is, our tradition will continue to be defined by people whose interests are not in line with ours. Like, I think that in any sort of religious tradition, there's an insider perspective and an outsider perspective. And I think that, if you're too much of an insider, that's a danger, right? Because you become blind to your flaws and you can become chauvinistic about it. If you're purely an outsider, that's also dangerous because you're not sympathetic to the perspective of the people who are in the community. And you're looking at purely as a sort of like, this is knowledge that I can capitalize on and exploit in order to further my own career. And I think the one thing that we're lacking is we lack, you need to try and hit the intersection of those two, right? Where you have people who are insiders, who are sympathetic to the insider perspective, but they're trained in the outsider perspective, right? So they're able to kind of step out of it, look at the community, look at the tradition somewhat objectively, while also understanding how people within the community look at it. And I think one of the issues we're facing now is that so much of the dialogue, whether it's in academic or in media, the experts that are called upon, the people who are writing these articles are all outsiders, and they're not sympathetic to the insider perspective, and they don't have that perspective. But it's not something that we can expect. We can't expect them to seek that out by the goodness of their own hearts. You have to, to go back to the theme that we've, I think, been emphasizing a lot. You have to have institutions that are willing to fund fellowships. You have to have institutions that are willing to publish. You have to have institutions that are willing to pay people to speak about their work, to drive, to create the incentives for speakers, for academics and scholars to be more sympathetic to the insider perspective. So, I think that, I think it's, we should be very proud as, people of Indian origin. Like, we have a very rich history of intellectual inquiry and debate, and so I think academic freedom is very important, and it's something we should support, but that shouldn't stop us from scrutinizing and criticizing, frankly, the colonial inheritance of the modern academy, right, which exists. I mean, there's no doubt that if you look at Vishwa Adluri and Dr. Joydip Bagchi have been doing great work to kind of expose the colonial prejudice kind of built into Western Indology departments. You see that kind of reproduced in a lot of South Asian studies departments now, and until we're able to kind of break into that system through the allocation of resources and institution building, and focusing on like what Ruchir was referencing, like the manuscript preservation, our traditions will continue to be defined by people outside, and so that's definitely, I think, I look at that as kind of a critical issue as well.
And one other thing to add to that is that the community itself needs to draw a red line. For example, do you think that the imams of Iran, if some Catholic wrote a critique of Shiaism, would they be like, oh, yes, this is, this is so true, we're so terrible, start beating their chests and, dismantle their entire religious structures? Similarly, there was a famous Greek pagan called Kelsos. He was a political philosopher, one of the earliest critics of Christianity, who used to say in his writings that, Christians are very underhanded. They try to convert children by coming as tutors to their house and convert servants. And then if they got caught, they would blackmail the kids and the servants saying, oh, only you can save me and only I can save you. Now, does the Pope lie awake at night in the Vatican saying, oh, Kelsos, 2,000 years ago, said that my religion is so terrible? No, absolutely not. It's absurd. And similarly, you don't have African pagans given the right to define what Anglicanism is or what Sunni Islam is, or you don't have the indigenous people of the Amazon defining what evangelical Protestantism is or Roman Catholicism is. So similarly, you have to treat it with the same disdain instead of saying, oh yeah, because the white man said it and because he's rich, because he's powerful, it's because his values are superior, it's because his knowledge is superior and everything he says is the gospel truth, unintended.
No, very well said, and I love the enthusiasm and the energy that both of you are bringing, and I'm 100% sure there are many more people of your age group and your profession who would be very keen to get involved. Sanjay ji has started Jaipur Dialogues, and it is narrative.
Can I just weigh in on this?
Sure.
Yeah, this question of actually, you asked the question was about caste. So the whole thing about caste is that, first of all, they denigrate Indians about caste. But the 33,000, or some people say 44,000 denominations among the Christians who clearly discriminate among each other on that basis somehow doesn't find any resonance anywhere. Anyway, the whole thing about this whole caste business is, of course, we know this very well, that caste is not jati and it is not varna, and it became synonymous only in the 1901 census by a gentleman called Lord Risley, Herbert Risley. That is well known. My issue about this, I've seen this a lot of times. We become, sometimes quite defensive, and sometimes we search for answers. The one thing that is very clear is that the jati discrimination, or the varna discrimination, as it is called, and it is often cited among the Western Indologists, and is taken as a proof. It doesn't exist in the scriptures at all. Wherever this discrimination has existed, it has only been a behavioral distortion. It is not a doctrinal truth. So of course, sometimes the situation is compounded by some of our traditionalists. They going gaga about, then misinterpreting the verses and saying that, okay, we are the superior one. Prime example being Swami Nishchalanand Saraswati of the Puri Mutt, who misinterprets 4.13 of the Bhagavad Gita, which says the Chaturvarnyam Maya Srishtam Guna Karma Vibhagasha. So he goes round and round and somehow makes Varna and Jati synonymous or something. But the largest corpus of all scriptural literature in Sanatan Dharma, in Sanskrit, it's absolutely clear that Varna was actually a social occupation-based dynamic prescription. Then as societies evolve, then things do change and behavioral distortions do take place. The Indian communities, they had a very, very strong system of reformation that used to happen over time. As a matter of fact, the Manusmriti mentions that it is compulsory to amend it within 3 generations, that every 3 generations that must be amended. And not only it must be amended, it even prescribed a procedure for amendment. And that's how the scriptures are. But if you compare it to Abrahamic religions, the discrimination is prescribed by doctrine. For instance, the race theory. The race theory doctrine can be clearly found. If you look at the Ham story, if you look at the Cain story, the curse of Cain and the curse of Ham, and it's very, very clear racial doctrine in Christianity. And of course, the less said about Islam, the better. They absolutely, for them, Quraysh is at the top, then Sayyid, and all that. They have what is called the Kufu doctrine, the doctrine of equality, which is actually a doctrine of inequality. So we must differentiate when we defend the doctrinal and the behavior on one side, and of course go very deep into it. I have held number of dialogues on this. The recent one was with Professor Subhash Kap, who's written some very good papers on this. I think you could invite him to discuss that particular proposition.
Thank you very much. I mean, look at it this way. Now, we have begun a program series on God, Godmen, and Godzilla. The entire global issues we can discuss under the heading. But this is very important. And a lot of people ask about how do Hindus achieve unity? Why doesn't government do something? And I say, approach Bhagavad Gita and you will get the lesson. It's so very simple. The four paths of karma are what? Meditate, devotion, service.
I'll have to excuse myself, Vibhuti ji.
No, we are ending it. We are ending it now.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is that don't complain about what government does, but follow the path of devotion, path of service, path of understanding, and path of meditation. That's what it is. Do whatever you can to the best of your ability to the cause that you believe in. Friends, thank you for joining us. As is customary, I will definitely request, we need help, we need support. So like, share, press the bell icon, subscribe, and make the world go around. As NRIs, I call ourselves the new responsible Indians. And every Indian must become the new responsible Indian. On that note, thank you very much for joining. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and let's support our intentions very successfully.
Jai Bharat.
Jai Bharat.
Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.